On this episode of This Week in Linux, we discuss the new code of conduct in the Linux kernel. Purism announces a new product offering with the Librem key. We'll also check out some distro releases from Solus, Quirky, and Esquelas Linux. Then we'll cover some of the latest beta releases from Elementary OS and Fedora. Later in the show, we'll cover some great Linux gaming sales going on this week. All that and much more coming up. I'm Michael Tunnell with Tux Digital, and this is your weekly source for Linux GNU. Up first in the show this week is the topic that everybody would expect me to cover, and that is the Code of Conduct topic for the Linux kernel. The Code of Conduct has replaced the previous Code of Conflict Code of Conflict document for the kernel. That makes more sense. And this is a new way to address the community's interaction with each other, because there has been admittedly, there absolutely is sort of a toxic environment in the Linux kernel for a long time, and it also has been pretty much Linus has been involved in that toxicity. There's many examples where you could say where it's one thing to say that you're being abrasive about someone's code and stuff like that, saying your code is terrible, we're not going to accept it, things like that. And in my opinion, that's perfectly reasonable when you're going to be abrasive or rude. Even if it's fine if you're focused just on the project and just on the code. It's not so good when you go to personal attacks and abusive language, and there have been those in the past from Linus and others in the kernel community. So it makes sense that they want to address that. And they did institute something in March of 2015, where was the Code of Conflict, which the intent was kind of to address that, but they really didn't enforce it, so it didn't really do anything. This is more of a revamp so that it could be addressed. And now I would say that in general, Code of Conducts are not necessarily a negative thing. They could be used in a negative way if they were written ambiguously and things like that. But in general, just the idea of a code of conduct could be beneficial to a community because it gives you people a direct documentation to check out to see what is and is not allowed, kind of thing. So I'm not saying that code of conducts themselves are necessarily bad, but there are arguments that some people have said that this particular code of conduct has some negative light on it, in the sense of it has been used in the past to kind of force people out of other projects and stuff like that. So I'm not really sure. That there are some negatives and there's some positives. I think overall code of conduct is good. I don't know. There's some pieces of this particular code of conduct I don't really like, because in certain sections it's very specific, and I do like the idea of having specific terms that people could reference, but there's also some ambiguous language inside of this code of conduct that kind of makes it open-ended for both negative and positive usage, so it could be potentially bad. So hopefully they'll maybe revamp it again to kind of remove the ambiguous nature of it, and that would be fine with me. I think if they were just to remove the ambiguous language, it would be a perfectly acceptable intent for just to have a code of conduct like that. So overall, they could do that, or they could check out other ones. Some people might not know, but there are other projects that also have codes of conduct, such as the Gentoo project has one, KDE has one, many others. So it's not like a code of conduct themselves are detrimental to projects. It's just ambiguous language can kind of imply some negatives. So we'll see what happens in the future, because we don't really know. I would suspect that there is very little likelihood that anything would be forced out without the the main people taking the reins of it. So for example, if you think about it, the Linux kernel is the most important piece of software ever created, and I don't say that lightly. I mean, some people would say they would exaggerate. This is the best, this is important, or things like that. I would say that the Linux kernel is the most important thing that is, as a piece of software in general, that has ever been made, because of its massive usage throughout just the world. So for example, 80% of the internet is running Linux. All Android phones are powered by Linux. Vast majority of Internet of Things are powered by Linux in some way. Kindle devices are Linux. Pretty much all top 500 supercomputers. Actually, no, it is all of them. So all of the top 500 supercomputers in the world are running Linux. So it is a very important piece of software. So I can understand why you'd be very cautious about what goes in and gets into the kernel and things like that. So I understand why there's some kind of pushback on this situation, but I do think that we should kind of like just see what happens, because I would be shocked if the project were allow any kind of manipulation of itself, because there's been people trying to manipulate it for years and they've refused. And I would be absolutely shocked if this would be anything other than just a base point of here's how we want people to be treated, things like that. So ultimately, I think this is not going to be a big deal, but we'll never know until later, and we'll see, I guess. But there was an interesting thing that someone said in the community was that they said that their biggest problem they had with this particular code of conduct is that the language used demands the member of the community to act a certain way, but it holds them to some good sounding standards. But the trouble is that it's overreaching. So the code of conduct should be a document that describes how you could get kicked out, rather than a criteria for being allowed to stay. And he's saying that it's against the openness of it. And I think that that's a good point that we could leave it on there. So if you want to have a conversation in the comments below, or in the Telegram group or Discord or anything like that, you'll find a link to all of that in the show notes. Up next in the show is Purism has announced the Librem key. And Librem key is a USB device that allows you to do security implementations, kind of like the YubiKey or the Nitro key. In fact, the the Librem key is in a partnership with the Nitro key. So the company Nitro key creates this, and Purism makes modifications to it, and adds their brand to it and things like that. So they're working together to make this particular key. It's a $59 device, and basically what happens is there's an LED light on the device, so that when you plug it in, it'll blink green, which means that you're fine and there's no issues. And if it blinks red, it implies that there's a signal tampering of some kind. Or signaling a tampering of some kind. So this has a lot of features. For example, it has the ability to store GPG keys, use those GPG keys over SSH, one-time passwords, so with support for two-factor authentication, all kinds of things like that. They also have plans to add features for unlocking disk encryption, so that when you insert the key, it will unlock it at the boot time. Also having the ability to lock the screen when you remove the Librem key, and other things as well, as like logging into your system automatically using this key. So you could set a passphrase to your computer, or a login password for your computer, and then the key would institute that. Things like that. So that's a cool concept, and there are other options. So if you want to check out, Nitro key is also existing, and the YubiKey and things like that. So based on my research for this particular announcement, I found some community members who are familiar with this particular type of topic, and they said that they're glad to see that it supports ECC, but there's no mention of the Curve 25519 functionality, so that's why they're going to keep using their YubiKey. So that's an interesting point, because the YubiKey announced not recently, but a few months ago, probably like 6-7 months ago or something like that they were going to close source their product. And they used to be like the only option, because it was open source, it was solid product, all kinds of things. So they kind of created their own market they created their own competitors, or give them competitors actually like a reason to look at them, because when YubiKey was open source, there was really no reason not to just use a YubiKey. Now there kind of is. So that was a weird decision on their part. But anyway, the Librem key also, people were saying, well, isn't this just a Nitro key? Why would we care? So the difference is, I'm not sure if the Nitro key will eventually have this as well, but currently the Librem key has integration with the Heads BIOS, which makes it possible so that if someone has tampered with the laptop, for example, you would be able to see at the BIOS level when you boot the machine if it has been tampered or not. So that's a very interesting thing that, the Nitro key probably should add that too. But anyway, if you're interested in checking out the Librem key, you can find a link to that in the show notes. Up next in the show is Quirky 8.7.1. This is the first release in the Beaver series, or the Quirky Beaver, which is based on the Bionic Beaver 1804 of Ubuntu, or specifically 18.04.1 of Ubuntu. And it is an x86-64, so it's a 64-bit architecture. And if you haven't heard of Quirky before, Quirky is essentially a fork from Puppy Linux. And also, the creator of Puppy Linux is the same guy who makes Quirky. So Barry Collar, I think it's Collar, he's the guy who created Puppy in the first place and decided to fork it because he had some different opinions of what the community wanted to do versus what he was going to do. So he created Quirky instead. And Quirky is an interesting system because it has a lot of, it's more up to date typically than Puppy because Puppy is a very specific workflow, and Quirky even started without being like runnable in RAM. It is now, but in the beginning it really wasn't for that purpose. So it's a really interesting distribution, and it has updated all the packages for their core baseline of Ubuntu 1804. But also they've done some extra stuff where they've updated the kernel, so the kernel is now 4.18.9. So it's the latest version of the kernel sitting on top of 1804 with the approach to infrastructure that is very similar to Puppy. So if you'd like to check it out, it's a very interesting distro and might be worth checking out for some. It's not going to be not for everyone because it has its own particular way of functioning, just in this very similar way that Puppy has its own particular way of functioning. But if you would like to check it out, you can find a link in the show notes. I'm going to probably say this wrong, and I apologize up front, but Aeschylus Linux. I'm not sure. Anyway, Aeschylus Linux 6.1 was released recently. And Aeschylus is a educational purposes with a Spanish focus. The highlight of this release is that they've actually released an English language ISO for the non-Spanish speakers. So that's pretty cool. And if you haven't heard of this, it's actually interesting because I haven't paid attention to this one in a while, but it's based on Bodhi Linux, and it's also based on the 1804 version of Bodhi. And it's running the latest kernel, well, almost latest kernel with 4.18.8. What's really interesting is this particular project has been around for 20 years, and they're celebrating their 20th anniversary with this latest release. That is really cool. And as someone saying in the chat room for the live stream, they're letting me know that Escuela, I don't know if I'm saying that even right, but they're saying that is Spanish for school, which makes sense why it's for educational purposes. So thanks for that. I appreciate the clarifications and stuff. But yeah, this is a really interesting distribution because the fact that it's been around for so long, and it's it could be and the fact that they're doing an English language allows me to use it more efficiently because I did check it out many years ago. I didn't realize how long it's been around, but at the time, but I did check it out and was completely lost because, while I can occasionally get some Spanish right, it's very little. So anyway, I'm looking forward to trying it out. And if you do try it out, you can check the link in the show notes, and also let me know what you think in the comments below or in Telegram or Discord and things like that. So in the chat room, someone has let me know that I definitely did not say it correctly. All right, cool. Maybe next time. I'll try again. Up next in the show is the Elementary OS Juno Beta 2. They released that recently, and this is the beta version. So if you haven't checked it out in a while, this might not be best for you because the Juno Beta is meant for developers and bug testers and things like that. So you might want to stick with Loki. Or if you are willing to deal with bugs, then recognize that they are bugs. They would probably appreciate any kind of bug reports and things like that. So feel free to do that if you would like to. But this latest version of Juno is going to be based on the 1804 Ubuntu and using the kernel 4.15. The 1804 LTS base, the Elementary usually bases their software on the LTS. Well, not usually, always, but so every release they make is going to be based on an LTS of the most recent LTS. So Loki was based on 1604, and Juno will be based on 1804. So they've got a lot of interesting modifications for this version of Elementary. I'll just talk about a couple of them, like the App Center is being like heavily modified and stuff like that. They've added a new application for code editing called Code. I guess Elementary Code, if you wanted to search for it. But anyway, it's going to have a Git integration into it, which is really cool because not a lot of text editors or code editors have that built in, and they usually have like a plugin that you'd have to do. So it's pretty interesting that they did that. And a lot of other things are like they've modified like some folder icons so that they're now more cohesive with their design. They used to have like different shades of blue, and now they're like making it more like cohesive experience. So that's pretty interesting. But overall, there's things that you might want to check out, but just keep it in mind that it is a beta, and this is definitely not a review or anything. So just there you go. Keep that in mind. Another thing that they did, which is really cool recently, is that they did an AMA on Reddit. So you could find out a lot of stuff about the latest release as well as the project themselves. If you want to check out the questions and the thread on Reddit, you'll find a link to that in the show notes. But it's really interesting because one of the questions that were asked was they had a couple things I want to talk about. One of them was what are some features that you're working on that you think will really improve the OS as a whole? And they said, as far as features for Juno, some big ones are the location services agents, the improvements for the App Center, features in Granite. Granite is their toolkit for making applications, and all these different things that they do for the design, the style sheets and icons and stuff like that. But then there was another interesting question that I was surprised to see it, but it was really cool because a lot of the developers and people in the project responded to it. And that question is, how do you avoid burnout? It feels like all of your team members are always active and pushing stuff, which is a really interesting question. And a lot of the answers were, how they handled it were like pretty interesting because in this space it feels, this kind of a job or, or just a project, just being in this kind of environment could be pretty stressful. So finding ways to deal with that is very important. So if you want to check out what they said, they all have different opinion how they did it, and some of them were like, instead of doing like here's the amount of times I work, they were doing it based on how many commits they were doing and stuff like that. So it's pretty interesting. So if you want to check those out, I'll have a link to that as well. And there's some other questions regarding like flats and flat packs improvement and snaps. Anyway, they also had a question that was pretty interesting, why they were allowing proprietary software included in the store and things like that. So if you want to check it out, you can find a link to that in the show notes. As well, if you want to find out more about Elementary, you can check out the episode 62 of Destination Linux, where we interviewed Daniel Flore from Elementary. So you'll find a link to that in the show notes as well. Up next is the ISO release for Solus. Solus version 3.9999. That's fun. Is released it's basically a beta of the next full release, but so keep in mind this is a beta also. But it enables support for a variety of new hardware released since the previous version of the original version of 3.0, and it introduces an updated set of default applications and theming and all kinds of stuff. And they've updated the kernel to 4.18.5. They've enabled the support for latest CPUs thanks to this kernel with AMD and Intel, and also they've added support for the high core count of CPUs, like for example the Threadripper and things like that. There's also a big refresh for the repository URLs because they did the domain switch from their previous domain to the new getsol.us. I think that's what it is. Yeah, getsol.us. So if you want to check it out, there's going to be a link to this version of these beta version of the new Solus for 3.9999 in the show notes. So I was clarified something in the chat room, so I wanted to address this in the show. So just to clarify this as well, that technically I'm wrong about it being a beta. The 3.9999 sort of implies that it's a beta, but because Solus is a rolling distribution, the refresh ISO is mainly just an updated ISO for the previous version, in a similar way that other Arch basically like Arch distributions, not other, but distributions for Arch will have ISO refreshes every once in a while to basically be the same version, but also have newer, up-to-date versions specifically in the ISO. So, yeah, thanks for correcting me in the chat room, and hopefully that solves any kind of confusion for this episode. Up next in the show is Fedora 29 beta is coming soon. And now this one, unlike the previous Solus, this one actually is a beta. So Fedora 29 is coming out actually the day after this episode airs on Tuesday, the 25th. So this one has a lot of improvements to the previous versions of 28, including some more updates to the modularity features and stuff like that, an updated version of Xorg, and many things. So if you're interested in checking out Fedora, the next beta will be coming out this coming Tuesday, or technically when this releases tomorrow. So anyway, also if you'd like to, you can check out an interview that we had with the project leader of Fedora, Matthew Miller. We did that on episode 87 of Destination Linux, so you'll find a link to that episode in the show notes below as well. And also another AMA was done this week with the Krita team, the software. If you haven't heard of Krita, it's a drawing and painting software so that you can make digital art, things like that. And they had a really interesting AMA on their subreddit, on the r/Krita subreddit. So it might not be it didn't get as much attention as the r/Linux subreddit for AMAs, but this was definitely something you should check out if you're interested. They had a lot of cool questions, and one of the questions it was the answer. Like the question was cool, and because it was really nice and polite, and the answer just shows how great the people in the project are. Because the question was, what drawing tablet do you guys don't have that you think it would help Krita development if you were to have it, so that the person who's asking could purchase it and send it to them? And their response was, well, for Linux, there's the Digimend project. Then they said that does need support. If you have the wherewithal to get different types of hardware, I would say share it with them and send it to Nikolai for testing. And because for projects like ours, we really just need the driver and OS combination to provide that standard that we can code against. So their suggestion is essentially, thanks for the offer of the hardware. Instead, send it to these other people because they would have more benefit than we would. So that's a fantastic response. So I just wanted to point that out. So there's also some other questions that you can check out if you wanted to, like their favorite features for upcoming projects and things like that. So you can find a link to that in the show notes, as well as a link to the Patreon for Nikolai and the Digimend project. Up next in the show is some interesting news from Canonical about Ubuntu desktop images available for Microsoft's Hyper-V gallery. Now, if you're not aware, Hyper-V is a virtualization system that Microsoft provides for Windows. And what's the reason why this is cool, and it might seem like, why are you talking about Microsoft? Who cares? Fair enough, I agree with that, but for the most part anyway. But for this is really cool because one of the things about this, the new things that they're doing with Linux and Windows is the Windows subsystem for Linux, for example. It is kind of giving confusion to people where they will accidentally, when they hear about, I want to try Linux, and they just install the subsystem and they just see the terminal and that's all they ever experience. Like, it has that part of a bit of a problem, whereas this would make it possible for people to use like a full Ubuntu desktop inside of Hyper-V, which has like hardware acceleration and stuff like that. So it gives potential for them to actually try like a legitimate experience with Ubuntu without having to install Ubuntu separately or dual boot or things like that. So it's potential to benefit people who are wanting to try out Linux for the first time and not, wanting to reinstall it. So I kind of like the way that they're doing it because they're making it more accessible to people. I mean, obviously, I would completely get rid of Windows entirely because it's Windows. But in the cases of people who haven't really tried Linux before, I think this is a good opportunity to make it, more accessible to them. So I like that. And if you'd like to check out the show notes for this particular blog post, I'll have a link. The link for this blog post in the show notes. That's what I was trying to say. Up next on the show is a release for Mir 1.0. Now, a lot of people have still thought that the Mir project has been dead because of the transition away from Unity, but actually, and Ubuntu Touch, but Mir has been, constantly being developed since then. It's just changing what its purpose is. So one of the purposes for Mir is for targeting IoT devices or Internet of Things devices, and making it possible to make like a next generation of IoT through Mir. And also they're working on a Wayland support compositing project as well with Mir. So this is really cool that they're mixing it up and what it's going to be. So I actually think this would be a good thing because it makes it possible for IoT devices to potentially, maybe, actually get updates. Right? Because they typically never do. It would be really great if they did. In this way, it makes it possible for them to just do sudo apt update or upgrade and get actual new software and security patches and stuff. That'd be great if they would just make that possible. So this is potentially making that possible because they have a new kiosk mode system where they have Mir-kiosk, which is essentially runs up a kiosk on Ubuntu Core, which showcases a lot of cute applications that give you examples of what you could do with a kiosk utilizing Mir. So that's pretty cool. And they've also made it where it's possible to use Wayland directly through the Mir built-in with GTK, Qt 5, and SDL support implementations. So that's pretty cool. And they've also made it possible to use experimental X11 support via X-Wayland through the Mir kiosk mode and stuff like that. So it's pretty cool that this 1.0 of Mir is making a lot of changes and a lot of potential to be a solution for quite a few things, actually, the Internet of Things, and also as a compositor for Wayland. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens with this. And if you'd like to check out the blog post for this particular release, you can find a link in the show notes. Hey, I said that one properly this time. I like it. Up next in the show is basically the stable release. It's in the path to becoming a stable release. It hasn't officially been released the last time I checked, but Chrome OS 69 is getting ready to go stable with Crostini, which is pretty interesting because Crostini is the implementation of able to use Linux applications in Chrome OS, so that they will be able to use, at this point, they'll be able to use Android apps and Linux apps on top of Chrome OS. So it's pretty interesting. If you already have a Chromebook, and a fairly decently powerful Chromebook, like the low-end ones won't work, and also there's a list of ones that won't work because they don't have particular enablement stuff in their motherboard. So if you do have a Chromebook and you like to check it out, you might want to check out the device list of I'll have a link to that in the show notes that expresses which one works with it and which ones don't. So they use the code name, so you'll have to look up the code anyway. Yeah, so anyway, this is pretty cool because it does make it more accessible for some people who already have Chromebooks to get used to using Linux applications, and therefore maybe convince them to use actual Linux, because this is kind of Linux, technically, but not really. Anyway, so maybe it would guide them to more likely to use actual Linux. So that'd be kind of cool if it happens, who knows. But it is interesting, and I have tried, I actually tried Kdenlive on a Chromebook before during a talk I was giving at Southeast Linux Fest. And that was interesting because when I needed to demonstrate some features of how to use Kdenlive, I realized that the Chromebook doesn't have these particular keys on the keyboard. And that was an adventure. Anyway, if you'd like to check out Chrome OS, or the release notes for Chrome OS, you can find a link to that in the show notes, as well as the supported devices list. Up next in the show is Linux Gaming, and this is a really big sale right now. So if you want to check it out, that's why I included it. It is the Bundle Blast from Fanatical. And Fanatical used to be called Bundle Stars, but now that they changed their name. So Fanatical's Bundle Blast currently has 28 bundles available. Now, not all 28 include Linux games. Actually, 12 of these bundles include native Linux games. But because of Steam Play, it might be possible to get some of these other games working in Linux as well. And if you do, be sure to leave a comment in the video to let me know, as well as maybe potentially submit it to the Steam Play community website if you'd like to test it or not. But at the same time, you could also just go to the community site and see if there are tests already for the particular game that you wanted to play from these bundles. And I'll have a link to both this particular bundle set as well as the Steam Play community website for the checking if you'd like to in the show notes below. And also to let you know that the link for this particular bundle is a affiliate link. So if you purchase something inside of this, you buy one of these bundles or something from Fanatical with that link, it will give a credit to the Tux Digital channel. So it'll help benefit the show as well as get you some really cool games. Because there are a lot of cool games in this, because there's so many bundles, you're bound to find something you want to play. So anyway, Fanatical's massive Bundle Blast sale. You'll find a link to that in the show notes. Up next in the show is another bundle from Humble Bundle. It's the Game Development Book Bundle. And this is actually pretty cool because there's a lot of books in this that might be interesting to some people, especially if they want to do Linux game development, because there's things like beginners C++ game programming, practical game AI programming book, and even there's actually a couple things for the Unity engine as well as the Unreal Engine and the Godot engines. So if you'd like to, because all those support Linux, so if you'd like to check those out, those are available. And as well as the Vulkan Cookbook, which is kind of fun to say as well, Vulkan Cookbook. Anyway, if you'd like to check that out, there's a link to the Humble Game Dev Bundle. Those books are going to be actually, to be clear, that's also an affiliate link. So if you do decide to purchase it through that will be benefiting the Tux Digital channel as well. So anyway, link to that in the show notes. And also just a quick information, if you are watching the stream live, I'm just going to give you a quick notice that Ballistic Overkill is available right now for the weekend at 50% off. And if you're not watching live, unfortunately, it might not still be available when this posts. It's possible depending on when you watch the episode, like a couple hours or so. So maybe, hopefully, you will be able to get it. Ballistic Overkill is a game that we in the community play quite a bit. So if you'd like to, it's only like $6 right now. So, or maybe when I post it, I don't know. But in the future, if you'd like to keep up to date with things like that for like weekend sales and stuff like that, I post links to those on the Twitter and Mastodon account, as well as like Telegram and etc. So if you'd like to, you can go to tuxdigital.com/contact to find out how you can follow the channel on Twitter and Mastodon, etc. And finally this week, the Culling, which is a battle royale game that has been around for quite a few years and actually started in 2016 before the craze started, before PUBG, before Fortnite, and it's had some rough issues over the past couple years or so, and now they've actually announced that they've fixed a lot of these bugs, and they've announced that the game will now be a free-to-play game. So if you'd like to try it, there's really no reason not to, because it's free to play, and there are going to be some they call it the coal crates, which if you wanted to buy cosmetic upgrades to your guns and things like that, you can do so. But what's really interesting about this particular game is that it has a lot of variety of how the game is done, in the sense that it's not just guns and shooting people. There's also there's swords, there's crossbows, there's even just regular bows and arrows and stuff like that, even chainsaws. So it's a really interesting approach to the battle royale idea, because not only is it not just a regular here's a bunch of people on an island, the regular way that battle royale games are being done. It's doing it in a game show contestant type thing. Anyway, it's interesting. You would check out the link to Gaming on Linux .com's web article about the game. You can find they'll have a video that describes like the trailer video for there as well. So if you want to check it out, you can find the links to those in the show notes below. Thank you for watching this episode of This Week in Linux. If you like what I do here on the show, please like that smash button and be sure to subscribe. If you'd like to support the channel, we have multiple ways you can contribute via PayPal, Patreon, or even affiliate links by going to tuxdigital.com/contribute. Or you can order the Linux is Everywhere t-shirt by going to tuxdigital.com/Linux is Everywhere. Or if you're in Europe, you can go to tuxdigital.com/Linux is Everywhere EU for European shipping. If you'd like to see more podcasting goodness from me, then check out the latest episode of Destination Linux, as I'm a co-host of that show. Just a reminder, this show is live every Saturday, so join us in the live chat room to discuss all the latest Linux news each week. The stream time is different each week, but you can find out what the time is for that week's show by going to tuxdigital.com/thisweekinlinux. If you scroll down, you'll see the time zone converter to make it easier to see what the time is in your area. Thanks again for watching. I'm Michael Tunnell with Tux Digital. And as always, keep using, learning, and enjoying Linux.